now have to return to a wartime way of thinking. So we have to be prepared to make a national security case for critical industries.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Gwythian Prins, Emeritus Research Professor at London School of Economics and advisor to NATO and the Ministry of Defence. Gwythian warns of the urgent need to remove net zero dogma from our industries and military.
How is it that there are serious people inside the Ministry of Defence who are seriously entertaining these things? Is it that they just don't understand the basic physics?
We discuss the shifting attitude towards green policies and who really benefits from them.
As far as the Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping is concerned, their view of the green world crisis model is that it is principally a useful weapon which can be used to encourage us to self-harm.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Gwythian Prins, Emeritus Research Professor at London School of Economics and advisor to NATO and the MOD. Gwythian, thanks for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So just to set the scene for this interview, and you've advised on national security at the highest levels, are we in peacetime or are we at war now?
Well, that's a very good question, because we are actually at war, but not in ways that people immediately understand. Meaning, there aren't bombs dropping in London. There are bombs dropping in Kyiv, and there are rockets being fired at Tel Aviv. So we're in a world war of many different theatres simultaneously, and many different modes of warfare. So for hot war, the two examples I gave already, we have Ukraine and Israel, who are both on the front line of the free world. And people watching should really clear their minds. They should have no illusions. These two countries are fighting their battles, but they are fighting for us as well. Because if they falter, if they were to fail, God forbid, and if it were to happen because of lack of support from the rest of the free world, and I'm using the old-fashioned language again, then we will find that we may be facing directly kinetic warfare, as it's often called, which means throwing hot metal around and explosives. And the next target, and the one which has most importantly to be deterred, familiar to many of your watchers, I'm sure, is Xi Jinping's often stated ambition to achieve what he calls the reunification of Taiwan by the 100th anniversary. And if he isn't successfully deterred, then he may well have a pop at Taiwan. So that's hot war. But what makes this complicated for people, I think, is that that's not the only form of warfare. People often think that it is. You know, it's like watching war films from the Second World War. That's only 1/3. The second is Cold War, and Cold War is largely economic. And here, we in the capitalist free market societies, because that's what we are, we depend crucially upon the smooth running and interlinkage of world trade. And we are threatened at every point by Russia, by Iran, and by China. In many ways, Iran is the forgotten one in this, because if you think of it like a telephone exchange, Iran is really the center of the telephone exchange, because all the lines to Russia and to China, and of course to their proxies, the Houthi and Hezbollah and Hamas and so on, they all go back to an exchange in Tehran with the shaky regime of the Ayatollahs. And so there is economic warfare against us being conducted in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways bleeds into the third form of warfare which we are engaged in. And this is, by the way, not a matter of choice. This is a choice of our enemies. Our choice is whether or not we understand that this is what's happening. The third form is often described as grey warfare. And this is a mixture of information warfare, and that can be conducted by propaganda. It's also conducted by subversion, by introducing, for example, very large numbers of Chinese researchers who, it turns out, in some rather worrying research done by the now director of the Legatum Foundation, Radomir Teilkut, he tracked down Chinese researchers within the British defence research establishments where I used to work, and he found them in the most extraordinary secure places. Right. He found Chinese researcher working inside the most secure facility in the atomic weapons research establishment where we design our nuclear warheads. So human penetration, very old-fashioned spies, basically. And then on top of that, of course, very sophisticated electronic warfare, which means hacking, very sophisticated hacking. It means in these days deep fakes. It means artificial intelligence. How many of Generation Z really understand what's happening when they're dancing their silly little dances on TikTok, for example? You probably know, but many viewers perhaps don't, why TikTok was set up. Because what TikTok is providing back to China are millions, perhaps billions, of Caucasian facial images on which the Chinese can train their AI and surveillance systems, just as they have done on Asian faces already in China. So you're actually providing a resource to possibly our most potent global antagonist. So if you wrap all of that together, you have a multimodal, multi-theatre global conflict.
We've recently seen some planned closures of steel factories. I wanted to understand how these impact this heightened national security need.
Well, this is really the moment when the music stops. It's the title which we gave to this, if I'm allowed to show it to the audience, a rather nicely illustrated set of essays published by Net Zero Watch, entitled The Music Stops, Net Zero and National Security. And I contributed the first one of those, which deals with steel and electricity and national security. The closure of the Port Talbot steelworks, as I point out in the essay, there is a respectable peacetime argument for doing it, which is that actually in the world today we produce very little steel in the UK. We mostly import finished steel products from China. So we don't matter to China, but China matters an awful lot to us. And you could make a peacetime argument that says, with the division of labour, better leave it to the coal-fired economies of India and China, where they have abundant, cheap electricity, or the United States. And here in this country, we have the third most expensive electricity, industrial electricity in the world. Right. People aren't, I think, really aware of that. And that high price means that actually it's completely uneconomic to produce steel by any means. Now, given what I just said in my earlier answer about the general state of this new 7 years war type of war that we're living in, we need to look to our own defenses. And those involve making things, weapons. In these islands, crucially, we need to rapidly rebuild our utterly dilapidated Royal Navy. And for this, you need large quantities of steel and special steel, and it needs to be under our control. But at the moment, and going back to the peacetime case for closing these blast furnaces, we have to import because we've closed all our steel, all of our coal mines, and we don't have the iron ore available. But you cannot do that in the world that we're now in. We now have to return to a wartime way of thinking. So we have to be prepared to make a national security case for critical industries. And steelmaking is a critical industry, as is the electricity grid, which will perhaps come in a moment, which underpins it. For that, we have to confront the unrespectable argument for closing Fort Talbot, which is the one the government is making. Now, it's unrespectable because they're saying we want to close these blast furnaces because they produce lots of carbon dioxide. And so we want quote-unquote green steel. And of course, no steel making is green steel. But of course, it takes only one moment of reflection to realize how specious that argument is. Because as the iron and steel trade unions have pointed out, and they've published 2 very good reports on exactly this, we're still going to need the steel. It's still going to be manufactured somewhere. The somewhere is probably going to be China or India, probably at the moment mostly China, as I mentioned a little earlier. And so all you're doing is that you are exporting your emissions elsewhere, but also because, as I told you earlier, we buy finished steel products rather than doing the manufacturing, we're also exporting high-value jobs. Yep. So this makes no sense economically, and it makes absolutely no sense if we are now going to re-inhabit a national security frame of mind, given the world we're in.
So I mean, we've seen Germany move back to coal production. They were over-reliant on Russian energy. And is this something we should be following suit in as well?
If one is arguing that the blast furnaces should be kept open on national security grounds, how will that be done? In order to do it, it means that we will have to secure 2 things. We will have to secure supplies of metallurgical coal, which can be dug from mines in Cambria. But much more fundamentally, the sensible thing for a country like this to do, and remember, we're the country that invented all of these technologies. It's sort of humiliating. In fact, we did just show the viewers another nice picture. This is an 1805 picture of Coalbrookdale at night. So these are the very, very first blast furnaces in the world, which were in this country. And rather than silencing them, closing them down, we need really to do what the Germans and the French have done, which is to have a sensible balance between BOS, basic oxygen steel from blast furnaces, and recycled scrap steel through electric arc furnaces. In both cases, it's a 60-40 split. That would be a logical thing for us to aim for. But we're not doing anything like that. And if we wanted, the government says it wants to replace the blast furnaces with electric arc furnaces because they are greener. Well, let's just open that up for a moment. What does that mean? Electric arc furnaces use vast amounts of electricity. I mean, leave aside the other question, which is whether there's enough clean scrap to be able to supply them. But let's just say, right, we're going to do what Tata is being paid by the government to do. They're being given a £500 million, well, let's call it what it is. It's a bung. I'm sure they wouldn't be doing it unless the government paid them to do it. Why do I say that? Because our electricity prices are now among the most expensive in the world, there is no rational market case for building electric arc furnaces in Britain whatsoever. So essentially that £500 million bung is a subsidy to cover the fact that British electricity prices are uncompetitive. So therefore we have a double issue. One is, and they're linked, one is the national security issue, which is our main topic of conversation, but of course entwined with that inseparably is energy security. And if we're going to secure the grid, then we cannot do it as a matter of simple thermodynamics. We cannot do it with renewables. Renewables, so-called, and I say so-called because they're not really renewable, because how are they built? They consume firm power to manufacture the steel, the concrete, and all things to build the windmills and all the rest of that. So there's nothing green about this specifically. That is, if you're bothered about carbon dioxide emissions as being somehow uniquely privilege there's a problem in the world, which we may want to come on to, but which I don't think actually the real science supports. But if you want to secure the electricity supply, and the Germans, as you correctly pointed out in asking this question, have faced this question and have been actually quite courageous about it, you have to be hard-headed and clear-eyed. Perhaps it's a German characteristic, perhaps it's Teutonic. And this means you have to admit to mistake. Now, under Mrs. Merkel, the Germans engaged on something which was called the energy change, the Energiewende, in which they simultaneously, because of pressure from the very, very strong green movement in Germany, which under their electoral system gave the Greens important positions of power in governments, which of course they don't get under first past the post here. But in that situation, where Greens were actually actively in power, they adopted this rapid building of renewable generation, wind farms and principally wind farms, and solar to a degree, although of course it's the wrong latitude where we all live. The sun doesn't shine here quite the way it does in the Sunbelt. But that's what they did. And they made the classic mistake of not thinking right the way through. They concentrated on the visible bit, which was building the generators. They didn't think about all of the infrastructure that has to go. It's a totally new grid. You have to have inter-switching and so on. And they produced chaos, not only for themselves, but also for the whole of Eastern Europe, because they had feast and famine. It's what happens with renewables. Either you've got too much or you've got too little. And when they had too much, they tried to maintain the stability of their grid. And here we're going to come back to electric arc furnaces, because if you don't have stable electrical power, you can very quickly destroy the anodes and destroy the smelters, both for electric arc and also for aluminium making as well. And it happened in Germany. Aluminium industry had a couple of major, very expensive crises as a result of the electricity supply going unstable. The way they tried to deal with this was simply flooding the whole of Eastern Europe, the interlinked grid, with German excess electricity, which created chaos. So in the end, their neighbors, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all these other places, they put actually the electronic equivalent of border controls to stop German electricity flooding. So the Germans were left with their own problem, which was what you do with all of this stuff. Well, what we do here is that we pay more bribes to the renewables producers. We pay them to switch off, so-called constraint payments. So if your wind farm is producing too much wind, then you get paid sometimes more per megawatt hour to switch these things off than, I mean, it's the economics of the madhouse, than to actually generate electricity from them. But given that they'd also switched off or were switching off their nuclear power stations, what were they going to do? Well, they went back to coal. They built at Karlsruhe the world's most efficient, currently running commercial coal-fired steam generating electrical power station. And it is, in the acronym AUSC, Advanced Ultra Super Critical Coal, which means that it burns coal with a thermal efficiency that's almost 50%. And when you compare that to a traditional coal-fired power station, which is like 28%, or the ones in the picture I showed you a moment ago at Coalbrookdale in 1805, which is about 1%, you can see how far we've advanced in this way. And so they are going to backstop the security of their electrical grid in that way. And one of the things that I argue in The Music Stops is that we in Britain, now that we are in a world again at war in this rather worrying way, need also to have a very grown-up conversation with ourselves and realize that luxury beliefs like net zero need to be chucked overboard. You know, when a warship goes into action, the captain sounds action stations and you clear the decks of all unnecessary detritus. Over the side it goes. Well, that's what we have to do now. We cannot afford any longer these indulgences. And so we need to go back and reopen coal mines. We have abundant, we're lucky, we have abundant geological provision in South Wales. We've got anthracite mines. We could, very expensive, but we might have to do it, reopen the deep mines, many of which were actually deliberately damaged when they were closed 20, 30, 40 years ago. But we need to go back to doing that. And because nuclear power stations, which would be, of course, the logical base load, yes, of course we must have nuclear, but it takes a very long time to get there. And as the Germans have demonstrated with Karlsruhe, you can build these new, very big, very efficient coal stations, really, relatively speaking, very quickly. If we don't do that, we are left where we are today, because the light shining in my face and running the camera and everything, where does all this come from? Well, if the wind isn't blowing and if the sun isn't shining, the so-called famous Dunkelflaut, when it's dark and when there's no wind, we rely on one primary fuel in Britain, which is gas, which is a noble fuel. It shouldn't be used to generate baseload electricity, but we do. So everything is dependent upon having gas. And that gas at the moment is extremely vulnerable, because now we come back to the national security case, because if your primary energy that keeps the lights on and keeps people warm is dependent on a very big, very long pipeline of 700 miles to Norway, on interconnectors, electrical interconnectors going to the continent, on a constant carousel of ships bringing liquid natural gas from Qatar and from other places to Milford Haven, if any of those things are interrupted, and all of them are eminently interruptible in a war, we know this because of what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines in September of 2022. Nobody knows actually who did it, but it happened. It set a precedent. The most authoritative study on that incident describes it, I think, quite accurately as the most consequential act of sabotage in modern history. And I think that's right, because it's broken a taboo, it's set a precedent. So we are in a position where we are hugely vulnerable. And so we need to develop national resources again, but not, and people must clear their minds of this, I'm not sitting here suggesting that we go back to the world of London smog before 1953. Of course not, because the coal-fired grid, which kept the lights on through the Blitz and kept the underground supplied and so on. Of course we're not going to go back to that, the old Battersea power station. We're going to use our brains. We're going to build the best that modern technology can do. And so bringing coal back in as an interim, along with gas, means that we can restore what we used to have in the old days, when actually we had the Central Electricity Generating Board, and we had something which was called the Merit Order. And the Merit Order was well known to everybody in the control centres of the grid, because it meant that you brought generators online in order of their cost, their low cost, and their availability. So, there is a perfectly logical set of engineering solutions to producing a stable grid again, but it will not meet any of the criterias of the net zero dogma. You have to set that aside completely.
Before we move on to the green policy more generally, I had one more military question for you. There was talk of senior military figures wanting the military vehicles to be carbon neutral. Can you talk to us about how realistic that is and give us some examples?
Well, I certainly can, and you'll find it in the net zero collection. One of my colleagues there, who's a very distinguished professor of combustion engineering, Gautam, has given some frankly hilarious examples of just running the numbers. Right. To understand why this is not only nonsense, but also what Jeremy Bentham would have called nonsense on stilts, you need to know, viewers need to know just one metric, which is the measure for energy density. And it's measured in watt-hours per kilogram. So it's a material, and it's how many watt-hours, in other words, how much energy for how long you get out of a kilogram of a material which it contains latent energy. Yeah. And it can be a liquid fuel, or it can be a battery. And so just to start off, people need to be aware that there are major, major differences, which at the moment are unbridgeably different. Liquid fuels, on which the world runs, diesel, upon which the world runs, diesel as a fuel has an energy density of between 12,600 watt-hours per kilogram and 13 or thereabouts. The best batteries, lithium-ion batteries that we have at the moment, are somewhere between 185 watt-hours per kilogram and 200, with aspirations of trying to get them up to maybe 250. So it's not just an order of magnitude. Yeah. It's like many, 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 many orders of magnitude. And so what the professor does in our study, Professor Gautam, is simply apply this to a range of military vehicles. And shall I just read out his numbers for you?
Please do.
Right, so Professor Kalgatli tells us this about aircraft. He describes how the then Chief of the Air Staff, our Chief Marshal Wigston, wanted all British military aircraft to hit the net zero target by 2040. And he takes the Eurofighter, the Typhoon, 21,000 kilograms weight. It carries 4,000 kilograms of fuel with an energy content of 49 megawatt hours. A lithium-ion battery pack with the same energy content would weigh, wait for it, 13 times the maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft, assuming an energy density of 180 watt-hours per kilogram for the battery pack. And so he asked, where, pray, is the Air Chief Marshal going to put these batteries? Well, obviously he's not. So he then turns to the alternative, which is being very much pursued, which is SAF, or synthetic aviation fuel. And the problem with SAF is that it has a much lower energy density, meaning that you need to burn more of it for any given output of energy, so your range or your speed is reduced. But also it has a very disadvantageous power density. Now, power density is to do with the fuel, the feedstock to make the fuel. And if you're going to make this out of biological materials, it means there's an opportunity cost against using that land and the sunshine and the photosynthesis falling on the land to grow plants as feedstock to make this fuel, or to grow food to feed animals and human beings. He then turns to fighting vehicles. And for a Challenger tank, Challenger 2 tank, the figures are these that he gives. A Challenger 2 weighs 65 tons. It carries about 1,600 liters of diesel with 16 megawatt hours of energy. A lithium-ion battery pack with the same energy content, wait for it, weighs 89 tons. And so the professor asks, is the plan therefore to tow this thing around on a trailer behind the tank? But perhaps the most ridiculous example is when he turns to warships. And here he takes the aircraft carrier, the HMS Prince of Wales, which is one of these two very largest warships that the Royal Navy has built. 65,000 tons it displaces. And it has an electric final drive powered by marinized gas turbines and diesels. Now, it carries 3,500 tons of fuel with an energy content of 41,000 megawatt hours. A battery pack with the same energy content would weigh, remember the ship weighs 65,000 tons, the battery pack would weigh 150,000 tons. It would take 17 days to charge fully at a rate of 100 megawatts. although the battery might catch fire, he points out, because, by way of comparison, a Tesla supercharger is 0.25 megawatts. And so he asks, rather ironically, where on earth would you stow these things? And where would you find sailors prepared to go into action in such an infernal machine? And what happens to ocean pollution when it either spontaneously combusts or it gets sunk? And how do you propose to charge a mega battery in the middle of a North Atlantic gale in midwinter, hunting Russian submarines? Ah, yes, says Professor Gautam. Oh, yes, you might install Wärtsilä diesel generator sets, such as we already have. And anyway, would you then have any hangar space left to put aircraft on this thing? I mean, he then he says, the fantasy of net zero carbon vehicles remains a fantasy. Why are we even being obliged to write a formal rebuttal of such nonsense? And yet we are. So there is huge work to be done. How is it that there are serious people inside the Ministry of Defense who are seriously entertaining these things? Is it that they just don't understand the basic physics? Well, it may well be. Even worse, as a hypothesis, is that the people promoting this do understand the basic physics. Because as he ends his essay, who are the people who are rubbing their hands with glee to hear about this sort of nonsense? Well, it's the generals of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, isn't it? Because they're not going to be doing that. They have a coal-fired grid which is built and is building the PLAN, and they have no intentions whatsoever of meeting any of these net zero targets, not anytime soon, not ever.
Which one do you think it is? Do you think these people really do understand the implications of what they're pushing, or do you think they actually believe that net zero is the way to go?
I couldn't possibly tell you. I really can't. I mean, I think, because it's very common in other parts of government and universities and educational establishments, that this, and I will use the word very carefully, that this cult-like belief in net zero has become a sort of mantra. People don't understand it. It's a matter of faith rather than clearly understood knowledge. And so Professor Gautam's numbers, or any of the other things that we've described so far in this conversation, these things are simply unknown to them. And insofar as they are known, they're blanked out, just in the same way as in a religious belief, if you are confronted with things which offend your fundamental precepts, you will blank them out. You'll say they're the works of the devil. You'll say they're not true. You'll say that the people who say them are the work of the devil. Those sorts of things. So it calls for an anthropological rather than a reasoned, rational explanation, I think.
If we look at the Climate Change Act 2008, that's where the first 80% reduction in carbon came from. And Theresa May came along and upped it to 100%, hence we get net zero. How did those things get through Parliament? Where was the scrutiny?
None. We know that. That's a matter of historical fact. I mean, the uplift to give Mrs. May some semblance of a threadbare legacy for her threadbare premiership, it passed through Parliament in 80 minutes, I believe. And it was done on what's known as a statutory instrument. It wasn't even a properly debated piece of legislation. And so people nodded it through with one or two very honourable exceptions. But they said yes, 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 because it's a virtue signal. It's a way of saying we're on the side of looking after the planet. We're on the side of sweetness and light. We are against the dark satanic mills. And of course it is tied up with that whole interconnected self-harming and self-hatred, which is the ideology that produces moral disarmament in the West, and which has really, really spread across the English-speaking world after the death of that drug dealer, Mr. Floyd. Very regrettable, but that produced something completely disproportionate. And so we get what I think is called in critical race theory intersectionality, where everything brings in onto the victim from every different angle. They're standing at the road intersection and they're being bombarded in every possible way. And so the green agenda has been woven into this general ideology uncritically. And so in times such as we've been describing, because so far in our conversation we've been dealing with the real world, we've been dealing with facts and figures, some of which are amusing in their ridiculousness, but all of which pertain to an attempt to use reason and clear thinking to understand what the matter at issue actually is. And so what I believe we've reached now is a moment when what's often called in politics the Overton window, that is the window of what is actually possible to speak about rationally, is moving. And it's being moved by our enemies because of this state of this multimodal, multi-theatre confrontation which we're now in. And so for the first time, possibly for a very long time, it is possible now to interrogate the absolute fundamentals about net zero, the scrutiny which didn't happen in 2008, and to understand why the 2008 Act, it's like legislating for sunbeams to turn, rather like when Gulliver was on his travels and he went to the academy and met these earnest people who were one of whom was trying to produce sunbeams from cucumbers. I mean, it's that sort of craziness that we're looking at in this drive. And for what? Because the proposition which underlies the whole of net zero is that it is a settled fact that was first articulated in 1988 by James Hansen before the US Congress, that there is a very closely coupled link, almost a sort of control knob link between the emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and the temperature in the atmosphere. Well, I've been in and around this business since before then, for my sins. I'm not trained as a climate scientist, but I am trained in critical thinking, I hope, having spent most of my career as a Cambridge Don. And it isn't hard to see that when you look at these propositions, two things become clear. One is that actually the record, the track record, does not support that proposition of saying that this is a uniquely privileged causal agent. And why is that so? It's linked to the fundamental errors which underlie the proposition that makes net zero an argument. There are two fundamental errors in the theory of knowledge, and then there's a technical error which was made by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I'll mention all three. So firstly, the intellectual errors. The first one is to believe that it is possible to come to closure on something as complicated as the global climate system. We cannot say with absolute certainty, this is the single most important driving factor among the many. Why? Because the first question you should always ask when you're looking at a phenomenon like the global climate is, what sort of phenomenon am I looking at here? And what you're looking at is a self-organizing, complex adaptive system. The most complicated things about which we know. You and I both carry one around with us in our skulls. The human brain is also a self-organizing, complex adaptive system, meaning if you damage it, it's got this amazing power to reroute and so on. How does all that happen? How the equivalent for the climate is, how does it maintain stability with oxygen at a level that's breathable for all of us? How does it self-regulate? How is it cybernetically regulated from the Greek for steer? Well, the person who explained this first and most eloquently was the great James Lovelock. And he explained that when you have such a system, its most important characteristic is that it has many, 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 many feedbacks which interact, some of which we understand and some of which we don't. But the natural agents that are known to have in the past, before the Industrial Revolution, driven change in the climate, are still present today, and they are changing flux in the energy of the sun, volcanoes on the surface of the earth, phenomena such as El Nino, which is the regular, roughly 7-year cycle of upwellings and El Nino, of hot and cold water in the Pacific. These are massively more powerful in their effect in global climate dynamics than really, frankly, anything that we could do. And the good news is that on this theory, in this era in the theory of knowledge, we know from 35, 40 years now of intensive research, we know one thing with much greater certainty than when James Hansen went before Congress in 1988. We know that we are much less certain about these things than he was then. And that shouldn't surprise anybody who understands real science, given the nature of the phenomenon. In the language which we often use, this is a wicked problem. Wicked problems are problems where you can never know when to stop collecting data because you know that you've got enough, you've got closure, that it's a closed system, and you can say, right, I will now compute what the causal agents are. I mean, forgive me if this is a bit too technical, but it's important that people understand this. So when you've got a wicked problem, and the hypothesis of carbon dioxide's role in global climate system dynamics is a wicked problem, you cannot translate that into a set of actionable actions which reduce to a set of bureaucratic formulae as to which sorts of motor cars are allowed to drive in the City of London. It's fanciful. So that's the first error in the theory of knowledge. The second error in the theory of knowledge was one which I witnessed when I was working for the British Ministry of Defence and was loaned for a short period temporarily to the British Meteorological Office when they were starting up the Hadley Centre for climate prediction and research. Absolutely fascinating assignment, because these are people who are weather forecasters who are now beginning to, this was 20 odd years ago, who are beginning to turn their minds seriously to using supercomputer powers to modeling the global climate. And this is the second intellectual error. This is the second error in the theory of knowledge. Computer models, crudely, garbage in, garbage out. But these people are not stupid people. They were putting in huge amounts of real data. The question is, what were you getting out at the other end? The answer is you were getting projections, you were not getting predictions. And projections are different from predictions. I find in my long career now, the number of politicians who understand that difference is not great. But you cannot build actionable policies on computer projections because they are not predictions of what's going to happen in the future. They are not. Why? Back to the first error, because you're trying to model a wicked problem. Now, that's actually enough to tell you that there may be an issue to do with carbon dioxide, but frankly, in a rank order of risks that we face in the modern world, security risks, it comes pretty low. There are obvious benefits which are much easier to understand, which come from increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We know a great deal about this in historical time too, from the archaeological record. Increase the amount of carbon dioxide and you increase the fertilization rate of photosynthesis, so you actually produce increased plant growth, which can be very good for growing green crops, for whatever purpose you're wanting to grow them. So it's not a simple-minded thing which says carbon dioxide is somehow to be demonized as a wicked thing. It's, after all, a gas without which we couldn't live. These plants here behind us love it. What then fascinatingly occurred was that one of our colleagues, the distinguished specialist Professor Roger Pilkey in the United States, had been looking into the way in which the modeling work that was commissioned by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the United Nations had been used. And he discovered that quite sensibly, if you're going to do models, you need a range. You need a high range and a low range and a mean range. And many, many models were produced. But there came a certain point where all the models, and they are calibrated in terms of watts per square meter, how much energy is falling on an area of ground, making it warmer or cooler. That there were a range with high and low estimates of watts per meter, and unaccountably, it's never really been well explained, but he discovered that it had happened, the low-end range models were all abandoned. And the baseline model was the high range of 8.5. And so it meant that from that point on, it's been for about 15 to 20 years now, all the modeling work has started from a baseline which is unrealistically high. So you get an overestimate. Going back then to the second error in the theory of knowledge, if you are relying, which you shouldn't do, on predictions from projections, from models, you will find that you're systematically overestimating, and that was the other thing. So put those three things together and you have, in my view, a sufficient ground for saying this is untrustworthy, and certainly it's nothing that you would want to sacrifice your economy or your national security on. So that debate, that stripped back, what I've done is to strip this absolutely back to first principles. And we need to do that, and viewers need quietly to do that. This is not a question of belief. This is not, it isn't a cult-like thing, even though the Greta Thunbergs of the world, poor woman, see it that way. It is entirely something we can address with our intellects and with reason and with knowledge. And if we do that, we can see where to put this relative to other issues in the threats which the world faces today. And the good news is that this particular preoccupation, this if you like, this diversion which we've taken in world politics in the West for the last 25, 30 years, we can see that it was a diversion, and we can see that, rather as James Lovelock predicted, the natural world does in many miraculous ways, because of these brilliant interactive and mostly not understood feedbacks, it keeps itself. It cybernetically keeps itself balanced. And that's quite comforting to know, really. And I've traveled this journey, by the way. I mean, I started when I began. I was very much persuaded that we were looking here at something that was a national security threat. But as John Maynard Keynes says, when the facts change, I change my mind. And so that's been my intellectual journey through this particular part of the issue.
So you feel quite positive based on those three things and the Overton window shifting that a path through is opening up?
I think it can, but it will not be easy. And it will not be easy because we have now got two generations of young people who have been indoctrinated, and I use that word deliberately because it's not teaching. They've been indoctrinated with a set of propositions which they are told are unshakably proven. Poor Greta Thunberg forever chants the mantra of the science is settled. Well, what do we know about science since the Enlightenment? If it's settled, it isn't science. And if it's science, it certainly isn't settled. And especially when taxonomically we are looking at self-organizing, complex, adaptive systems, the most marvelous, mysterious, complex problems that we can solve, about which we know, of which the global climate system is one. So yes, I have some optimism that we might snap out of this, but it will be very, very difficult. And now perhaps we ought to think about what other people think about this than us. Because this has become bound up in this whole process of what I've described over the last year or so as moral disarmament of the West, intersectionality, the pervasive racialization of everything, sexual dysmorphia being turned into an issue when it is really a tragedy, all these sorts of things. And then this religious dogmatization, this cult-like dogmatization of green beliefs. All of these things swept up together fill, in my view, and I am by original training an African anthropologist and historian actually, so I see it very much in anthropological terms. These things fill a godlike hole in people's lives. In the Christian world, the post-Christian world, Christianity has essentially vacated the stage. And it leaves a vacuum, an intellectual and an emotional vacuum. And this stuff has flowed into it for that generation. And so we know from what happens in cults in history that cult-like beliefs are held within an intellectual shell that is very hard, like an eggshell, but it's brittle. And so if the shell breaks, it can produce enormous emotional turbulence and disorientation for the individuals who are suddenly told that everything that they believed about this worldview is actually not quite the way that it's been put to them. It's not settled. In fact, it's not true in many places. The test is going to come if we are challenged openly, more than we have already been, by societies which do not entertain this, of which the most important by a long chalk is China. I think it's quite clear that as far as the Chinese leadership under Xi Jinping is concerned, their view of the green world crisis model is that it is principally a useful weapon which can be used to encourage us to self-harm. And I say that having spent some time looking into the way in which the Chinese have tried to weaponize green beliefs. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier in one of my earlier answers, we do have colleagues who've looked with some care at the way in which the Ministry of State Security, and particularly the United Front Work Department, which you may know was described by Xi Jinping as a magic weapon of the communist state, which is responsible for subversion and subversive activities in our societies, in the free societies. It has clearly identified and sought to use these sorts of beliefs as a way of causing us to disempower ourselves. And my goodness, if that's even only partially true, perhaps it just needs a little push, a little bit of help from them. But we are now looking, a whole series of articles are coming out as we are having this interview about developments within the British Armed Forces, of all places. Just recently I read an article saying that climate change education was to become compulsory within the Royal Navy. No, I'm sorry, that's not what I want naval officers to do. I want them to learn how to fight their ships and defend this country. I don't want them to learn about intersectionality or theories of climate change being the science is settled and how correct Greta Thunberg's view of the world is. Absolutely not. These things have no place. And if they're there, all they do is to serve to cause us to self-harm. Chinese are paying no attention to this, and you know that by simply looking at the numbers on the growth of the Chinese economy, the fact that it runs on a coal-fired grid. Look at the International Energy Agency figures, which are the most authoritative for coal burning, and you can see that coal is king. Last year, the most recent report, coal use on this planet reached its highest ever level, more than 8 billion tons. The expectation is that for 2023, when those figures come in, it will break that record. The amount of coal that is used to generate electricity has passed all records. And the place where this is happening most, the two places actually, are India and China. There's contest between the two, as you know. And I'm not one of those who sees the Chinese as 10 foot tall. I think they have absolutely profound problems. I think they have problems for the legitimacy of the regime. I think they have massive demographic problems, which are partly self-harmed, self-inflicted as a consequence of the one-child policy. They now have this terrible problem of the generation of the dry branches, the young men who have no women. They have terrible, terrible age profile differences. They have awful consequences, which are totally predictable, from command economy control of how they went about infrastructure construction during the years of Chow Enlai, so that we now have ghost cities and we have railway lines that go and motorways that go to the wrong places, and all the things that happen when you try to command an economy. And the hybrid model which they tried to build clearly hasn't worked. And that actually isn't good news for us, it's very bad news, because my judgment, and I'm no sinologist, but I talk to people who are, and I read a great deal about this, is that I think that it makes Xi Jinping more dangerous, because I think it means that he will become more obsessed with protecting his reputation and his position by pursuing military objectives, such as the attempt to attack Taiwan, which will be resisted. And we will then find ourselves with the thing which we didn't resist when it happened, which was the Chinese population of these reefs that weren't anything until they built them up, the Spratlys and so on in the South China Sea, and the so-called 9-dash line, which they now claim completely outside any justification of international maritime law to be Chinese sovereign territorial waters. None of these things are true, but he will press forward with that in order to defend his own position. So we have this confrontation coming. And we, unfortunately, in this country, had a very unwise period under Prime Minister Cameron and Mr. Osborne, his Chancellor. They described it as the golden age with China. Well, it turned out they were not alchemists. They did not produce gold. The lead remains lead. And we, as I said at the very beginning of our conversation when we were talking about steel, now find ourselves critically dependent upon our global antagonist for the provision of fundamental things. And there is, by the way, on the steel front, I was just in correspondence with a colleague who works at a very high level in the Japanese steel industry, just to confirm it, because I'm not a metallurgist either, but I always check what I'm saying. And he confirmed that, of course, an absolutely insoluble problem with buying finished steel products from China is that you cannot have adequate quality control on the steel. That's, you know, if you buy it from the Japanese, who make exquisite, very high quality, very expensive steel, but you can be sure you won't then have failure. But you can't when you're buying from the Chinese. And so, you know, we find, what is the theme that we've really been discussing? It is that everything is linked to everything else, and that strategic analysis, geostrategic analysis, is the art of joining up the dots, which is what I've been trying to do in this most interesting conversation, and I hope that's been of some help.
So how can we defend our national interest from the Chinese Communist Party?
By believing in ourselves in the first instance. I have no doubt that, let me make a positive note, I live in deep rural England. I don't live in London. And I'm surrounded by authentic people. And they do believe in this country. These are the sorts of people who don't speak often. They don't vote often. But they have twice in the recent past. They voted in 2016 when they were offered a referendum on continuing subordination for this country within the European Union, and they voted to leave. To the fury of the London blob, who felt that these people who they insult, they call them gammons, they call them stupid, so on. They try to discredit the largest democratic exercise we've had in this country. But they did. They voted on that occasion, and they voted again in huge numbers in 2019 to get Brexit done. And it's the eternal shame of the Conservative Party that they didn't get Brexit done. So that leaves us in a political mess. But those people believe in what we stand for. They're proud of our history. I'm proud of our history. I'm extremely proud of the fact that this country led the world in the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. And it is beyond comprehension that the world has turned upside down intellectually for those who present us as being uniquely guilty in this regard. No. History, in any case, is a foreign country. They did things differently there. It's both facile and dangerous to impose modern values on our long-dead ancestors. That's not how you study history. You try to understand. You don't try continually to judge. And so here we come back actually to a central feature that has to be moved, has to be shifted, which comes with this whole so-called woke agenda. And that is the belief that lived experience, my feelings, your feelings, matter more than reason or evidence or logic, which is external to either of us. It doesn't. Our feelings are of no consequence. We will make no progress if we believe that society is to be intermediated and governed on people living as perpetual victims, constantly offended, and where everything has to be arranged in order to minimize the degree to which people are upset. I mean, that, anybody who's had children knows that that is not how you deal with 4-year-olds. And it's certainly not how you deal with a modern society. So we need to grow up, actually. And we need to grow up before it's too late.
Professor Gwythian Prins, thank you for joining us.
It's been a very great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.